Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Millstein Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Malkin Fund, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and only once over the series' half-century have I picked up the New York Times, seen a distinguished Columbia classmate's picture staring at me from a major story in which he played a major role, called and had him here on a related program shortly thereafterwards. Well, that's what happened just a decade ago. The Times story then was about a Blue Ribbon Commission's report calling for the important recasting of corporate boards in America, with my guest, today as then, Commission Chairman Ira M. Millstein, Senior Partner at the New York law firm of Weil, Gotshal, and now Senior Associate Dean for Corporate Governance at the Yale School of Management. Of course, a few years earlier, the Wall Street Journal had pictured, profiled, and I would say lionized my guest, characterizing him as the eminence grise behind a major board of directors revolt at the then, and once again now, ailing General Motors Corporation. Of course, an angry GM executive had called him a snake in the grass, but the Journal enjoyed Ira Millstein's sweet and spectacular triumph in his quest to reform the way American companies are run. Too frequently, unfortunately, with rubber stamp, inside-dominated boards of directors that, in his words, wait too long to respond to ongoing political, social, and economic change. Yet sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. And now, in what one might have hoped would be a brave new century, I must ask my guest today just how things are different now in corporate governance. After all, as I continue to read his many truly brilliant speeches and articles and book chapters, I find that Crusader Millstein obviously still has his work very much cut out for him, still must fight for the things he was fighting for when he was on The Open Mind a decade ago. Don't you feel a bit tired doing battle, Ira?
No, it's invigorating.
Well, why are things so much the same?
Well, they're not so much the same. They're different. The world has changed. I think it may not be visible to the naked eye, but it has changed. There will always be corruption, and there'll always be some fraud, and there'll always be CEOs who don't do what they're supposed to do. No issue. And we'll continue reading about them because the world isn't perfect and people aren't perfect. I don't expect it to be absolutely perfect forever. But if you look at boards of directors today as compared to what they were when you and I first talked, and heaven knows what they were before that, it's day and night. The board of directors today is a much different institution than it was 10 years ago, and certainly than it was 25 years ago. They are no longer handpicked by the CEO in most cases. They are mostly independent. And by independent, I mean by New York Stock Exchange definitions of independence. They are forming their appropriate committees. There are audit committees with duties. There are governance committees with obligations. There are all sorts of activities going on in the boardroom that didn't go before. But, you know, the question is, did those changes bring about inherent change in the way boards operate, or are they box ticking? This is the question which we won't know for a bit. They are all looking as though they're doing the right thing, because they have to. Sarbanes-Oxley has requirements. Stock exchange, NASDAQ have requirements. People who are watching them have requirements. So they're all doing what looks as though it's the right thing for structuring the board. That they are doing it seems clear. Now, does it make a difference? That depends on the board itself, and you never know until you're in the boardroom. I think in most boardrooms in which I've been called, they're doing something. They're doing something very different. They're paying attention. They're learning about the business. They're watching the CEO. They're being a good deal more careful than they were before about letting things go far too long before they make a change. That's the good piece. The good piece is that I do think they are paying more attention than they did in the past. The bad piece is there may be still a little too much love going on between the CEO and the board, too much affection, and a little
you
less
mean
criticism.
money?
I mean money, exactly. I think that the one place I find boards to be totally and completely deficient is in compensation. I cannot understand why boards have not reined in excessive competition across the board. Every day you read stories in the Times, and they've been really very good at following this and bringing it to the public's attention. Every day you read stories about compensation of hundreds of millions of dollars. And yes, these are good executives doing great jobs, but that's what they get paid for. They were hired to do a great job. That's why they're the CEO. They were not hired to make hundreds of millions of dollars. Moreover, the disturbing piece is the gap between the top and the factory floor. I don't remember exactly what the numbers are, but I think it's gone from someplace around 100 times, or maybe 50 times, to maybe 200 times or 400 times. And for me, as just a plain ordinary citizen with a little bit of morality, I just don't think anybody is worth 400 or 500 times the factory floor. It just doesn't seem right to me. So I think that the boards have got to begin to tighten their belts, screw up their courage, and begin to do the right thing. Nothing short of that is going to bring this under control. There's no way to legislate this. There's no way to issue a mandate that you must not pay more than $2.80. It's not possible. Boards have to really buckle down, pay for performance, and no more. And when it gets back out of hand, cut back. That's my biggest complaint about boards today. And if I were on the inside or on the outside looking in, I would also be cynical about whether boards are doing their job. However, the point I'm trying to make with you, Richard, is that I think they are doing their jobs, except here. This is where I find them really deficient. And I can't explain it other than the fact that they don't do it. I don't know why they don't do it. That would take some kind of a psychologist to help me understand why when somebody goes on the board, they feel reluctant to bring it under control. I know the excuses, by the way.
What are the excuses?
The excuses are that, well, he's a great guy, and we can't get him unless we pay that much. And he's looking at his peer group, and if we don't pay him as much as his peer group gets, then we will lose him, and he'll go someplace
And how
else.
valid is that?
It's not valid because I don't think they've tested it out. I don't believe that a potential CEO won't go to work for $10 million instead of $40 million. I just don't believe that. I don't believe that every CEO needs options which will carry him into the $100 million range. I think the younger CEOs coming along would like the job.
Yeah, okay, but with all that you've said about how things have changed, as I read the Times, many stories,
Yeah.
I'm particularly impressed with the interlocking directorate.
No, I don't.
aspect of
I
this.
think that may not, only in this sense. It isn't so much that they're all serving on each other's boards. That's going too. It
It's
is
not gone, Ira.
Nothing will ever go. Richard, you and I have been around long enough to know that we're not going to wipe the slate totally clean ever. There will always be hangovers from the past. I don't believe that serving on each other's boards is any more the custom, and I don't think that degree the back scratching goes on. I think the Times is great at picking out the ones which exist, and they always are in the bad cases. But more often than not, the definition of independence, the definition of people who ought to be on the boards, and a critical look by the people who watch sees to it that that sort of thing is less and less and less. I really don't believe that's the problem. I think the problem is of compensation lies in the consultants who are called in to give advice. And who are they called in by? Up to the recent past, they were called in by the managers and paid by the managers, and they were not exactly going to give advice which disturbed the people who were writing the checks. And so what did they do? They would look around and pick a peer group and say, well, now you want to pay him in connection with your peer group. And of course, the peer group might be a peer group that you or I might not have selected, but the peer group has a way of being the basis on which the payment is made. So if you pick the right peer group, it's not a problem. And that's generally what's happened. So you find escalating because the next CEO comes along, picks the same peer group, which by that time has elevated a notch. So the peer group keeps going up, and nobody ever sees the peer group going down and down. I think boards have to say to themselves, well, that's fine. We're very interested in peer groups and paying and compensation, but we should be more interested in performance. And we should be saying we're not going to pay unless there's performance. I don't remember which company it was just a couple of days ago, finally amended its compensation plan and said, here's the performance goal, and if you don't make it, you're getting nothing. Forget about the peer group. Here's what we expect you to do. We're setting a guideline, and this is what you're expected to do, and if you don't do it, you don't get anything. No extra compensation, no bonus. Now, as more and more companies begin to do that, you will find compensation beginning to get under control. I applaud the New York Times. I applaud the Wall Street Journal. We just have to keep a spotlight on this and embarrassing everybody until they get a little more common sense about what happens here. Another possible way of getting this under control are the institutional investors. They have a voice, and they are very important today, and I suppose we talk about that in a bit, but if they keep the pressure on in compensation, they too can bring about change by withholding votes from directors on compensation committees who have permitted compensation to get out of line. I think that too can make a change if they'll do it.
How sanguine are you about that? The great pension plans, for instance, the outside investors.
Not terribly, as you may have known from some of the things I've written. I'm beginning to query whether our system is really working the way it should.
You mean the corporate system?
Yes.
Or the system of corporations?
The system
limited liability.
No, that has to be.
We should talk about that.
Well,
but go ahead.
But the system of corporations is what has made the world great. I mean, I think limited liability and perpetual life. I believe in the corporation. I think it's the greatest mechanism that was ever invented to create wealth and jobs and so on. But that's not the issue for the moment. What the issue that I am concerned about is the paradigm itself. In other words, managers, boards, and shareholders. I had always believed that the paradigm worked with checks and balances, and that the manager had to be accountable to the board, and the board had to be accountable to the shareholder. And if the board wasn't accountable to the shareholder got rid of the board. Right? That's the way the system is supposed to work. Doesn't work really well too much today. That was a model that was fine when there were a limited number of shareholders who could meet at an annual meeting and throw out the board if that's what they wanted to do. But today, with the huge number of shareholders, the bulk of which are held by mutual funds or pension funds or corporate pension funds or banks or insurance companies, they're held by institutions. Some of those institutions are neutered. They don't act. Corporate pension funds really take forward positions for a whole variety of reasons. Up till recently, mutuals didn't do a whole lot in terms of activism. Banks don't do a whole lot. And the reason is that there's a certain amount of love and affection going on as amongst them.
We're back to that again,
And
right?
we're back to that again, and there's no issue about the fact that they have sort of neutralized themselves. Conflict isn't the right word, but by virtue of the fact that they don't want to offend their customers. That's a nicer way to put it. And so we've got to break that somehow or other, but I can't solve that one this afternoon. John Bogle writes about this a great deal in the Soul of Capitalism. He points out the great fault of the mutual funds in not paying attention to what's good for their beneficiaries. Put that to one side. There are a group of pension funds, public pension funds, which are active. So when we're talking pension funds and active shareholders today, we're talking about unions, TIAA-CREF, CalPERS, Madison, the public pension funds basically, some mutuals, no corporates, and no banks. That's what we're talking about. Now, they are active, but not very. And the problem for me is, how do we motivate them to become intelligently active in voting their shares, in voting proxies? Now, this is such a long story. It's hard to do it all in 2 minutes, but the fact is that the voting system in the United States is not great. In England, shareholders can actually throw out directors and recommend directors. In the United States, there is no such mechanism. We have a plurality voting system where the board puts up the directors, and the most the shareholders can do is withhold votes. They can't say no. They can withhold votes, but that doesn't mean anything, because under the plurality system, if you get one vote, you win. So if there are 100 shareholders and 99 withhold their votes because they're angry, and one votes yes, that slate wins. That's not a good system, and it has to change. It probably will. There are things happening now where people are amending their bylaws to require a majority vote and so on, and that's beginning to happen. It's not perfect, but it's better than it was before. Then the question is, will these shareholders, these new institutions, will they really vote intelligently, or are they going to follow the leader? And are they just going to take advice from somebody as to what to do? And there are now intermediaries who recommend how one should vote, depend on a variety of circumstances, and many, many of these institutions follow that leader. Well, that leader is not a public utility. That leader is not a for-profit organization of its own. And one wonders, how did this self-appointed leader of voting get there? And that's another long story. I don't see that system working very well.
You know what puzzles me?
Isn't this terribly complicated?
You know what puzzles me most, Ira, as I've read you over the years, and particularly recently, and I note that you come back to this notion of doing the right thing.
Yes.
How does doing the right thing, how do you reconcile your reference to Hebrew prophet?
Yeah, Micah?
Yes, and doing the right thing, good men doing good things.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that with the impersonal rule that you maximize your profits?
Well, I think it's hard to do. It's very hard to do. What one would try to do would be to take some of the things that drive people to maximize profits out of the system.
What do you mean?
Well, options. For
Human
example.
nature?
No, we're going to have people who want to maximize their own well-being. That's what it's all about. So what you do under those circumstances is try to circumscribe them with rules and regulations that sort of prevents them from doing too much of what is in their own self-interest.
But I gather you don't mean government rules and regulations.
I certainly do.
You do?
Oh, sure. I mean, certainly. I mean, price fixing, for example. Everybody thinks price fixing is a good thing to do if you want to maximize your own well-being and self-interest.
But
get
it's
everybody to
illegal.
agree on a price. But the government says no. So there are rules and fraud. I mean, fraudulently misleading shareholders is a good thing for you because you get them to buy the stock on misrepresentation. But the 33 and 34 Acts say, no, you can't do that. So we have lots of rules which circumvent maximizing your own personal value at somebody else's expense. There are government rules, and they're quite right. But that's only a box. And within that box, there's a lot of discretion for a corporate executive or a pension fund or anybody. And it's within that box that I think that doing the right thing makes a difference. An example, in the boardroom, you are confronted with whether or not to run a plant which may be on the borderline of polluting the community in which it lives. Right? There's no law yet that says you're doing the wrong thing by dumping a certain almost toxic substance into a stream next to your plant. But you know that that's really not healthy for the people who live there, even though it may not be strictly prohibited yet. Now, if you're sitting in the boardroom and you're confronted with that activity, I think a decent human being doing the right thing says, no, I'm not going to do that. And I believe that happens, and it happens more frequently. And it would be my, I don't know, mission is the wrong word, but it would be my hope that we would be able to convince people that when they're confronted with these borderline issues, the better practice is to do the right thing, and that in the long run, the company will benefit and you'll feel better about the whole thing. So at Yale, for example, one of the missions that we have at the new Center for Governance and Performance is to find out what would motivate people to do the right thing, what would cause people to think about corporate actions before they take them. And I don't give up on that. I really don't. I think...
You haven't discovered the answer to that question
yet. I think the answer to the question is to put a spotlight on it and tell people what their responsibilities are. I think making people aware of the fact that they have huge discretion and what they can do may well impact the society in which they live.
What about liability?
Liability is healthy, but, you know, these are not the kinds of things for which I really think liability counts. These are the kind of things which are borderline, where you're not going to get sued for doing it, but where you know you might not be doing the right thing.
Are directors liable?
Sure, well, they are, yes. But
what's the limit of their liability?
I don't think it's serious. I really think that if you are a diligent director and you do your homework and you act in a fair and decent manner, nobody's ever going to put you in jail. I just don't believe that. And I think my partner, the Chief Justice of the Delaware Court, Norman Vesey, and I have written on the subject, and we feel quite comfortable that directors who behave well, do their homework, are diligent, are honest and loyal, and are seen to be such by a judge are never going to be held liable for anything.
And where do you put in this Hebrew notion of doing the right thing?
Where do I put it?
I'm fascinated by that business.
Well, because I really do believe, I mean, you and I, for example, we're not such great people, but we try to do the right thing most of the time. I've been watching your programs, and you encourage people to think that way. And when I go into boardrooms, I try to encourage people to think that way. And one of the reasons why I've devoted myself to the center is that I think a center which is devoted to the proposition that people just might do the right thing if they knew that it was important, it might work. I just think that one begins to preach in the boardroom the same way you would be preaching in a religious institution. I know that may sound silly, but that's...
No, let's go back to my first statements, which you then contradicted. You were saying, hey, things have changed.
Yes.
What do you anticipate for the future? And no rah-rah speeches, realistically. Come on, we're too old to...
What do I expect? I expect that there will be resistance to everything I've said, because I think there will always be resistance to the kind of changes that might take excessive money out of people's pockets. I just think that's the way it is. However, I do think that the younger generation of managers is different than the older generation of managers. I think the younger generation of managers are much more aware of their social responsibilities than the younger ones were. They've been brought up a bit differently. They've been brought up in an era where the manager was not the king of the world. You and I grew up when the CEO of our major institutions were icons. They were worshipped. They were known to be the best in the world, and they were the height of society. That is not true anymore.
Ira, we've got a minute and a half left, but I need to say that I've been doing this for 50 years, sitting at this table. And when that sort of thing was said 50 years ago, I guess I sort of nodded my head and said, boy, that must be true. But now that younger generation is this older generation. Well, and we're saying the same things about them.
No, because I don't think things began to really change in corporate America until the 80s.
I see.
Until the late 80s. I think life was pretty much the same from post-World War until the late 80s. It was a period of management domination where we all worshiped the managers who were making America great, and then suddenly found they weren't making America great at all, that they were looking in the other direction and were much too self-satisfied. And I think the dramatic changes that occurred in the 80s and 90s brought along a new generation. They're not all wonderful, but by and large, the younger men and women, I think, are much more likely to be thinking about social welfare and to be thinking about what might be good for the world and not exclusively about what the bottom line might be. I'm optimistic. I really am. I meet them. I see them. Is it changing fast enough for you and me? No. But is it changing? Yeah, I think so. That's not rah-rah.
That's as fair an optimistic note to end on that I can think of. Ira Millstein, thank you so much for joining me again.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And for transcripts of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Malkin Fund, May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.